Okay, good evening, everyone. I've never had the opportunity to stand in such a prominent position before. It does give you a nice view. So, thank you all for coming this evening. On behalf of the Great Conewago Presbyterian Church, Cross Keys Village, Community Media of South Central Pennsylvania, the New Oxford Historical Society, and most importantly, all of the volunteers that have been helping with parking and sign-in and everything, welcome everyone to our inaugural event by the New Oxford Area Historical Society for our celebration of the nation's 250th anniversary, America 250. So my name, in case we haven't met before, my name is Mike Shen, and I'm the president of our Community Historical Society over in New Oxford. With me tonight is a wonderful lineup of individuals for tonight's program that we think will contribute each to a memorable, what we anticipate as a memorable evening. So in addition to myself, we have in the order of appearance, we have Joe Powles, who will be congregation representative, and he's one of the elders for the congregation in the church. We have Bob Wilson, who is a NOAA's director and retired historian from University in Georgia. We also have Barbara Rode. Where'd Barbara go? There's Barbara, who will be entertaining us again after Bob and Joe's pieces, featuring the organ here, and she'll have some things to talk about. And of course, Tim Smith, wherever Tim is, there he is, out back. Tim, he's the Adams County historian and the director of education at the Adams County Historical Society. And behind the scenes, we have Mark Worley from Community Media, who is recording all of this. So thank you all for tonight. So our program this evening is intended to highlight and honor some of the families and the institutions that first settled in this portion of South Central Pennsylvania, and then went on to fight in the War of Independence. As many of you know, the story of colonial Western York County, because after all, this was York County, is the story of the Scots-Irish, the Quakers, the Englishmen, the Catholics, the Germans, a blend of nationalities and religions all coming together in coexisting as best as they could in this region that we call our home. And so to tell that story about those early years leading up to the War of Independence, we could not think of a better, more fitting place to do that but here at the historic Great Conewago Presbyterian Church, and for that we are very grateful to the congregation for extending this invitation. Thank you very much. So I'd like to sort of begin with sharing with you a few selected events, chronology of those selected events that transpired that led up to the period that we are focused in on tonight. And this period is pre-revolution leading up to the revolution. And of course, so the idea is for you to try to imagine the world that we are in today and what it was then and the things that were happening around us. Of course, these stories or this chronology of events is not intended to be a complete narrative of everything, but it helps to set the stage, I think. In 1700, William Penn decides for the first time to meet with the Susquehannocks Indians over in Conestoga Town Everyone know where Conestoga town is on the eastern banks of the Susquehanna River in Lancaster County? This in Conestoga town is where the remnants of the Susquehannocks and the Conestoga Indians, the last remaining portions of that tribe, were living at the time. In 1705, 5 years later, John Harris, the founder of Harrisburg, actually settles and creates his trading post for furs and such, going up and down the Susquehanna River with the French to the north, on the shores of the Susquehanna, about where Harrisburg is today. And in 1712, he actually establishes the first ferry across the Susquehanna to the West Bank. Now, 20 years later, move forward 20 years to 1726, we have a gentleman by the name of John Wright. And John Wright was a Quaker. And he establishes a settlement on the eastern shore of the Susquehanna in Lancaster County, which is present-day Columbia, Pennsylvania, directly across Wrightsville. And in 1730, he was given a patent to open up a ferry going across the Susquehanna River. So by 1730, there are two pathways to the western shore. Meanwhile, we have the colony of Maryland. And Lord Calvert of Maryland provides or issues to John Digges in 1727 a grant, who was a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, granted 10,000 acres to him, which then became Digges' Choice down in the McSherrystown, Hanover period. This is all happening even before Lancaster County is officially created, because Lancaster County happens in 1729. So this is all part of the three principal counties that were formed when the colonies were established: Bucks County, Chester County, and Philadelphia County. But then in 1736, so this is now 5, 6, 7 years later, the Penns in Philadelphia established the agreement with the Indians on the West Bank, to where then all of the river Susquehanna and all of the lands lying on the west side of the said river to the setting of the sun is now the property of the Penns. That was 1736. It only took 2 years before the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians first held services in individuals' homes in this region. That became then the congregation that we in the church that we are in today. Only took 2 years. And it was even before the first public road west of the Susquehanna was actually ever laid out. And that was in 1739, going down from York, from the river, down through York and down with the Great Road to the Monocacy, to Frederick, in that area. That was even before there was a public road. And, of course, around here, the earliest land warrants of land being purchased, given away by the Penns, doesn't happen until 1742, 1744, in this immediate area surrounding the church environment, the greater Hunterstown area. But then, And to think of it, how many of you came up the road either from Route 30, Swift Run, or came down from 15 to Hunterstown? Raise your hand. That was the trace of the original 1747 Great Road from York to Black's Gap. And that is in 1747. That is after the individuals start settling this area and they start having their first services. A road doesn't even, a public road doesn't even exist. It is, in fact, Indian trails. And of course, Hunterstown doesn't really take shape until 1764. Years later, York County never takes, or doesn't happen until 1750. And we then conclude with the realization that all of this is happening before the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War happens. And the congregation, Joe will talk about the ministers, but the first one, Samuel Thompson, he doesn't show up in this area until 1752, about. So what this, I was hoping to demonstrate to you is that this was a frontier that got quickly populated. It did not take long after the ferries were put into place, after the Penns legally purchased the land took possession of the land, officially, legally, whatever. But we understand that story, that's a different story. And it was then that this congregation gets established. And to think that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart had yet to even be born is pretty amazing, in my opinion. So with that, I'd like to introduce Joe Pyle, who will speak about the congregation. Any questions?
Good evening, and welcome to Great Conewago Presbyterian Church. My name is Joe Piles, and I am one of the members of the church. Our church historian, David Shoup, is under the weather and could not be here, but he is the author of the book that's called A Moment in Time, that documents all the events of the history of Great Conewago Presbyterian Church. Most of the information I'm sharing tonight is from that. Great Conewago Presbyterian Church's congregation was founded by the Presbytery of Donegal in 1740. Although circuit rider ministers had been preaching in the area for several years, the congregation was considered part of the Marsh Creek settlement. In 1742, the Presbytery of Donegal recommended they establish two congregations: the Upper Marsh Creek Church, which is now Gettysburg Presbyterian Church, and the Great Conewago Presbyterian Church. They had no center of worship until they built a log cabin near the gates of the cemetery. And that was between 1743 and 1749. The log cabin was 32 feet wide by 40 feet long. It was very primitive, but it served as a sanctuary for over 40 years. And it was built of unhewn logs, and the benches were rough, and there was no stove for heat. Some of the worshipers would actually bring foot stoves to the services, and these were sheet iron boxes encased in wooden boxes. And they used to hold charcoal embers and would be carried into the pew, put on the floor, and they would put their feet on them for warmth. These devices were said to have been brought to this country by the King family. The settlers in this area were a hardy stock and built a strong Presbyterian base. For several years, the presbytery supplied ministers. In 1749, the congregation received its very first pastor, Reverend Samuel Thompson. He owned a farm south of Shriver's Crossroads, and it was called Tyrone of Castle Hill. Thompson served as pastor until 1779, a total of 30 years. He retired due to his age, he sold his farm, and moved to Sharpsburg, Maryland, where he died in 1787. In the late 1960s and 1970s, a granite memorial marker to him was placed inside the cemetery gates. In 1780, a call was made to Reverend Joseph Henderson, who was fresh out of the seminary. They promised him 697 bushels of wheat as his salary. He accepted the call. He was ordained and installed on June 30th, 1780. This stone church was erected, replacing the log building in 1787. It was built by the members of the congregation along with Pastor Henderson. All the stones were gathered from the church property to construct the sanctuary. The sanctuary is 51 feet wide by 65 feet long. The interior was originally one large room with 3 entrances at the pulpit. Reverend Henderson was the chief architect of this church. His name is on a stone on the eastern gable, which will be pointed out when you go outside. This stone bears the inscription, Joseph Henderson Meeting House, 1787. There is evidence of the taste and refinement of the handiwork in the cornices and the beauty of the 12 windows, the 12 arched windows, and the arched doors. The ceiling is also arched. And if you ever want to remember when the church was built, all you have to do is look up, because it's printed on the ceiling, 1787. The church is beautifully located, being situated and surrounded by native trees to the area. Reverend Henderson continued to serve as pastor until his retirement in 1795. From then until 1800, the church was served by supply pastors. In 1800, the Upper Marsh Creek Presbyterian Church and Great Conewago Presbyterian Church created a union and received a new pastor, Dr. David McConnelly. Each church was to have half of his time and pay half of his salary, which was about $200 each. In 1849, the congregation changed the layout of the church. The pulpit was moved from the east to the west wall. The pews were changed, and a choir loft was built along the east wall. The original entrances were closed with matching stone, and the new entrance was created on the east wall. The entrance now leads to a vestibule beneath the choir loft. As occurred with many churches in this area, during the Civil War and in the Battle of Gettysburg, this church was used as a Confederate infirmary and binding stations. In 1870, the congregation installed a new pulpit furniture, new pews, oil lamps, and carpeting. And then a complete restoration of the church was undertaken in the summer of 2002. And it was also completed in that fall. Roof trusses were reinforced, new pillars were installed to support the flooring, and the flooring was completely restored. retaining 80% of the original floor. The pews were refinished, the parking lot was enlarged, and a new handicap access entrance was opened on the north wall, and the choir loft was rebuilt. Elder Thomas Elledge crafted this Celtic cross from the timber salvaged from that old loft. Along with that, a public address system was added, a new restroom installed, and the entire building was air conditioned. The restoration was completed following strict guidelines of the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission to preserve the architectural integrity of the building. The Great Conewago Presbyterian Church is in continuous use since 1787 and is listed on the National Registry of Historical Places. Currently, the congregation is preserving this church by having the shutters and doors restored to the specifications required by the guidelines of the Historic Commission. And the shutters have all been done and are replaced out there now. It remains as one of the most beautiful sanctuaries in our Commonwealth. Due to local growth in this area and the dedication and fellowship of the congregation, Great Conewago Presbyterian Church is experiencing an increase in membership. Our Sunday services are 10 a.m. every Sunday and led by Reverend Dr. Brant Eaton. In closing, I'd like to direct your attention to the Weaver pump organ. The Weaver Organ Factory was in York, Pennsylvania from 1871 to 1959. They stopped producing reed organs in 1916. Our Weaver organ is known as the Ida G. Brinkerhoff Weaver organ. It was willed to the church from the estate of Margaret Brinkerhoff Tullenbaugh. It was requested that this organ be placed in the gallery of the church and that a memorial service be held every summer, in which it would be a memorial service to her sister, Ida G. Brinkerhoff, who was also a faithful church worker, and also to the memory of the other persons in the cemetery. During this time of this service, a silver offering is to be taken up and to benefit the Cemetery Association. This service has been scheduled every summer since we got this organ. And we just had it just this past July. At this time, I would like to introduce Bob Wilson. He is our NOAA's director and historian. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and all congratulations to this church for this beautiful and meticulous restoration of this building. It's stunning, and we're honored to be here. By the way, the phrase Scotch-Irish is, one should always say Scots-Irish, leave out the H, because Scotch is something that you drink, and it's really quite good, but that's not the people. The Scots-Irish are people from Northern Ireland, from Ulster. And my people were one of them. We came over in the 1820s, so the Wilsons are from Ulster. I would also say this, that the early Scotch-Irish that came to this area, first generation, I don't think people always realize it, but they spoke with the brogue, and they kept it, at least for that first generation. They're very distinctive. I have a bit of a sermon, and just a fragment, that I'd like to, I won't say deliver, but read. It was written by the Reverend J.L. Wilson of Philadelphia about the time that Reverend David McConaughey was here in this church. We don't have ones from this church, but I thought it would be nice to get a sense of what these people heard from the pulpit. And this, of course, is a very Calvinistic Presbyterian church. The sermon is called The Character of Man, and their basic view of the natural character of man was that we were all pretty bad. In fact, totally depraved and full of sin. So we have to start with that assumption. A state of total depravity. So this is a section of this church, and it's called What of the Businessman? And it's a classic sermon from the period. Under the spirit of the world, his time, talents, and affections are all absorbed by earthly things, and his chief happiness consists in expectations of greater wealth. All this industry, sobriety, punctuality, and economy exhibit a fearful example of that insensibility to eternal things, which places the man of business among the dead and trespasses in sin. Look at him in the house of God, for he sometimes there appears. Can you believe him the same man who yesterday you saw on his farm, in his shop, or behind the counter? His whole soul was then awake. Then his energies were vigorously employed. His heart and soul and mind and strength were passionate devotees at the shrine of Mammon. Today he slumbers. It is the Lord's day. The Bible to him is cheerless as the desert, the Savior a root out of dry ground. The doctrines of original sin, transgression, the incarnation of God's eternal Son, the one sacrifice of Jesus Christ for our reconciliation to God, the resurrection for our justification, the ascension and exaltation of our great high priest for our encouragement, the renewing, sanctifying, and consoling power of the Holy Ghost for our salvation, the rewards of the righteous and eternal damnation of the wicked are unintelligible mysteries to the worldly man, whose heart is choked with the cares of avarice, the deceitfulness of riches, and the lust of other things. He is dead in trespasses and sins. Wake, you slumberer. In a heavenly vision, John saw 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing." And every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and such as are in the sea, all that are in them, heard I saying, "Blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever." My fellow Christians, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be unto our God forever and ever. Amen. Now, if you're thoroughly cowed, I'd like to introduce Barbara Rode, music director of the church, who will honor us with some music from this great old organ. Barbara.
Oh, I don't get to step up here very often either, but I want to make sure you all hear me. The pump organ is a joy to play. As was said before, we do at least one service a year where we have a coin offering, and we try to play it at Easter and Christmas and now and then in between. So the typical old organs do not have many stops. So it's kind of limited as to the voicing. The volume comes from, I will show you this. Okay, the pedals, and there are two paddles, I call them, that you have to press like this for volume. So you do both. And I hope you all heard that. I had to show that because you can't really see me doing it when I'm up there. But that's where the volume comes from. This is a medley of three. I just chose patriotic songs. They're familiar. If you feel inclined to sing along towards the end, the Spirit moves you, you're welcome to. But this gives you an idea of what our wonderful pump organ sounds like. When I first started playing it, I hurt. but now I'm used to it. So, okay, pedals and the paddles. There we go. Okay, there we go. Now, there's no sound without the pedals. Isn't it a beautiful organ? Yes. We are very blessed.
Yeah. And a great organ. Okay, now we're ready for, who's ready to go for a walk? Right. But before we can do the walk, I have to introduce our speaker and our lead tour guide for the part 2, Tim Smith, who's sitting in the back.
Okay, so my name's Tim Smith, and I'm the historian at the Adams County Historical Society. And so, in Adams County, just for your knowledge, we have about between 100 and 120 cemeteries. It depends upon how you count. Isn't that weird? Like, for instance, you count the Gettysburg National Military Park as a cemetery, people are buried there. Obviously, prior to the establishments of formal cemeteries around the county, there were settlers and people lived here, and people died, and people were buried in their yards. Sometimes those, smaller cemeteries are marked as private burial grounds. So again, it depends how you count them. And then, of course, there's the fact that there's a bunch of cemeteries that no longer exist, that did exist at one location, and I'm sure they carefully removed all the bodies to another location. So, like in the town of Gettysburg, for instance, there's like 8 cemeteries that used to be there that are now houses. So, do you count all those places around as cemeteries? So, with that in mind, I wanted to mention that, what is the earliest stone in the county, marked grave that we have? There's a guy named Henry Sell who is buried in Christ Church, Christ Reformed Church near Littlestown from the Conewago settlement. And he died in 1738. Now, I've been there, and the stone is not the original stone. But there may be a couple 1730s stones in that cemetery. Some of them are in German, so it's kind of hard to see. There's according to Find a Grave, there's a private cemetery on Chestnut Hill Road, and they say there's someone buried there who died in 1740. I have not seen the stone. I have not been there to look at the stone. It's a sort of a private burial ground. I'm not sure if they have an old stone there or not. There's Gertrude Banta, who is supposedly buried in the southern Low Dutch Cemetery. That's on Low Dutch Road. And she died in 1740. But again, I've been in that cemetery, and there's just some stones there. They don't have dates or anything on them. I don't know. Lower Marsh Creek has several graves from the 1740s. And one guy, David Stewart, had a stone, and it was dated 1741. And we know that because there's a list of all the stones in that cemetery in the 1886 history. But that stone no longer exists. And the earliest stone in the Lower Marsh Creek Cemetery, Byers Lane, is 1749, if you were on that tour. But here, in this cemetery, we have a stone for James Ross, born about 1674, and died on December 5th, 1741. His wife is listed on the same stone, and she died on December 11th, 1741. So there's a 1741 stone in this cemetery that we'll visit. And as far as I know, I could be wrong, as far as I know, that's the oldest stone in Adams County in this cemetery. You know, we're going to walk down to the cemetery. Perhaps there's 1,000 people buried there. There are many people buried there without stones or markers, or those stones or markers have, you know, been removed or have, you know, disappeared over the years. I think Find a Grave, if you look on it, they say there's 745 people buried there. And some of the people listed on Find a Grave are listed there without stones. So I would guess about 1,000. So again, that date, 1741, is prior to the log church that was down there near the cemetery. And of course, they mentioned that this stone church, you can see up there, the Reverend Henderson Meeting House, dates from 1787. Now, that's also the date of Conewago Chapel's original section in eastern Adams County. So, you know, there's a little debate about which one is first. But since we're here at this church, shouldn't we give it, because, you know, I think next couple weeks I'm doing a tour over there. So at the moment, we'll say this is older. That's right. So again, now let's take a little walk down the path into the cemetery and talk about it down there. Okay, so I wanted to point out that there's a stone here with a marker on it, and this stone was dedicated on June 25th, 1940. And that would be the 200th or the bicentennial of the founding of the church. So they had some ceremonies here to dedicate this stone. And Tuesday evening, June 25th, I believe I have it somewhere. But it's interesting when I read about it, the keynote speaker was Dr. Henry Young. And he was a York County historian that had spent a lot of time researching York County's Revolutionary War soldiers. And we have a lot of his papers transcribed at the Adams County Historical Society, and people come and use them to learn about their Revolutionary War relative. Also, in the audience, making a short remark was F. Mark Bream, president of the Adams County Historical Society. An address was given by Burl McPherson of Gettysburg about some of the facts and the Revolutionary War soldiers buried here. And then Dr. Young himself spoke. And he told of the raising of money in Strabane Township for the relief of Boston, and stated that Strabane was among the first to drill militia in the state, and that the first county men were sent to New Jersey in the summer of 76 from here, where many had enlisted in something that's referred to as the flying camp. Now, you probably know a militia unit from Gettysburg actually went to Boston and joined George Washington's army up there at the time. He related various activities of the county committee and how they handled local matters during the American Revolution, and his papers are filled with that. And I got to tell you, it's very confusing to me. Revolutionary War soldiers are in multiple units. They organize and reorganize units, for periods of time. And it's very difficult. So when you have a relative that served throughout the war, they might have been in 4 or 5 different units. And we do not have individual muster rolls for the men in the American Revolution. At the state archives, we have the names of the units and the commanders of the companies and the officers, but not the individual soldiers. So it's difficult. But he mentions, Henry Young, there were Strapan Township men at Valley Forge. Others made trips to the frontier against the Indians or the Tories. They did guard duty at the most important assignments, speaking probably of camp security in York. And there were militiamen on the Pennsylvania line. And so there are on this monument, there are 30 names. When Dave Shoup wrote his book on the history, he noted that there were 33 men that have plaques on their graves here. And also, there are probably others that we don't know about. You might see the last line says James Ray and others, since we don't have very good records of the individual soldiers in these units. And it makes sense. Just for your knowledge, there are other markers like this in other cemeteries that were placed at different times. Christ Reformed Church, I mentioned in Littlestown, and I think it was 1976 during the bicentennial. They put a marker with the names of the men that are known to have served in the Revolution that are buried in their cemetery. Bender's Lutheran Church put a really nice marker like this up in their cemetery in 1979. Lower Marsh Creek Cemetery has a nice stone with the names of their Revolutionary War soldiers that was put up in 1990. And I'm sure there's a couple others in the county that I'm forgetting about, but you can check those out if you like. I wanted to mention that there's another stone behind us that gives the names of the men who were buried in the cemetery that served in the American Revolution. And I just want to talk about a couple of them. These men from this area that served in the American Civil War actually were descendants of the men who served in the American Revolutionary armies. And Robert Bell, who's buried right back there, was a son of Robert and Martha McElhenney Bell. I saw Bob somewhere. There he is. Okay. And a grandson of a Revolutionary War veteran, James Bell, who actually had served and enlisted from Taneytown, Maryland in 1777 and served in the Maryland line. And he's buried, is it the second fenced-in area down over there? I think? Over there. Okay. Over there. Okay. Bell, let's see, James Bell had died at age 92. He was a husband of Rebecca Horner Bell. And I remember that John Horner, if you remember him, was related to this family and always would talk about them. And of course, I guess Robert Bell was a cousin of his. Bell was a farmer living here in Strabane Township, Adams County, in the 1860 census. He lived, if you drive south from the center of Hunterstown on Granite Station Road, you might know that the Adams County Prison is built on Robert Bell Drive. So not far from here at all. He formed a militia unit in 1863 called the Adams County Cavalry for the crisis, and was involved in some of the skirmishing on June 26th, 1863. That unit later became the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry. He became captain of Company B, I believe, and then major of the unit. And he was at Appomattox when Lee surrendered. And, I'm sure that he was very proud of his grandfather's American Revolutionary service. I wanted to point out that there's a civilian, and he's buried not too far right over here. It's a more modern stone. His name is Jacob Watson Tockenball. And I think he was 14 years old at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. 13? Okay.
Actually, that brings up a very good point about age, because as we were looking through and doing the research of the veterans that are buried here, we came to the conclusion, a couple of conclusions. First of all, there were teenagers, 13, 14-year-old veterans that went off as part of the York militia to fight for the independence. They were generally the sons of their fathers who also went off to fight as part in the militia. They were in their 60s. There's the McElhennys as one example of that family, and the Giffens, where father and son are both fighting in the militias. Teenager, 60-some-year-old father.
So Jacob Watson Tockenball, and that always bothers me. Is it Ball or Bach? I guess it depends on how the family wants to pronounce it. Like, you have Hullaball, Hummelball, Tockenball, and then you have spelled the same way, B-A-U-G-H, Balker or Bauer. Have you heard it pronounced a bunch of names, different ways? Good, I'm glad I already caused an argument. That's all right. Go ahead. Did you want?
Is that a common name around here they're talking about?
Oh, yes.
Okay, because
So,
I own a house down in Hunterstown that was once owned by people named Talkenball.
yeah, the common name. Now let me point out that, we think of the people here as being, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. And really, this church became a church for the local families. So we have Germans that lived in the area that also made this their home church and intermarried with the Scotch-Irish families. Should I mention that I believe it's Scotch, not Scots? That's a modern interpretation. We can argue about that too sometime. So, Jacob Tockenball, there's a really nice civilian account about his experiences during the Battle of Gettysburg, and we have it at the Adams County Historical Society. And it starts, Mr. Jacob Tockenball celebrated his 100th birthday on the 7th day of December, 1949. His home he lives in is the same he lived in 87 years ago. 87 years ago, a number of boys from South Carolina, together with their friends from other states, visited the already ancient stone house. And they found a welcome of sorts. And Jacob Tockenball has vivid memories that keep him good company to this day. So he lived to be 101 years old. And he's, like I said, buried right over there. I can't see the top of the grave, but just right over there. And in his account, he talked about Hunterstown before the battle. He talked about the Battle of Hunterstown. He went to the battlefield of Gettysburg afterwards and visited the battlefield, and just has a remarkable account. And I wanted to mention that he's not the only one from here that has an account of the battle. Margaret Brinkerhoff Tockenball, do you remember her? She had the organ. She was 3 years old, I think, at the time of the battle. You know, we know the year, 2 or 3. She has an account about a soldier from Michigan who was wounded at her house, and then in later years, their family came back to visit with her family. And of course, William Storick, one of my favorite historians, has a account where he interviewed some of the Hunterstown people about the Civil War and things that occurred here. And one more thing, Hugh McElhenney, who is, I guess, the grandson of 2 McElhenney Revolutionary War soldiers that are buried over their father and son. He actually had 2 sons that served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And one of them is buried here, William McElhenney of Company C, 1st Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. And he's married to Jane Graft, who also is a Revolutionary War veteran and is just buried right over there. So the people that live here have strong ties to their relatives that served in the Revolutionary War. One other note, John Tockenball McElhenney, and these families are interrelated. Do you get that? Brinkerhoff, Tockenball, McElhenney. He, at the time of the battle, was the editor of the Star and Banner in the town, you know, over in Gettysburg. And he is the one who kept a diary that talks about sleigh riding in the 1850s up to Hunterstown and back with, you know, the girl he eventually married. I did a program on that last year. I don't know if you remember in the cemetery. Okay.
Do you want to go over to that grave that's the 1741?
Yes. You go start over there.
Over there.
One last thing before we're going to walk to another spot is that I mentioned that Tockenball is 101 when he died. There was a lady that I knew that I worked with very closely in the 1980s and early 90s, Elizabeth Tangent. Anybody know her? She's buried over here. She lived to be 101, and she was the research assistant at the Adams County Historical Society when I started. And so she was very well connected here to the people in Hunterstown. And one other thing, there's a grave down at the end of the cemetery. It's got a flag next to it, just down to the left a little bit. And that is Robert Wilson. Do we have Robert Wilsons here? There he is. Robert Wilson down there, according to the stone, lived to be 107. And so he is the person that's buried here that lived the longest. So you can always check that out and go down there, Robert. 107. I can't find any evidence to confirm that fact, but it says it on this grave. What are you going to do? Okay. Okay, so when you go around the cemeteries in Adams County, especially the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian cemeteries, the art, the art on the stones is just fabulous. I think Nancy DeLong in our Adams County History Journal, I think it was volume number 7, did an article about gravestone art or tombstone art. And there's a book by a guy named Daniel Patterson called The True Image. And this is a book about gravestone art in the culture of the Scotch-Irish, he's wrong too, settlers in Pennsylvania and Carolina's back country. And we got a copy of it at the Historical Society. I'd recommend if you're interested in this, you come check it out. The guy did a lot of research on stones in North Carolina. And he realized that the artwork is the same as it is, in our area. And sure enough, there's a guy named William Bigham. And he actually is a stone cutter or, an artist here making stones. And then he moved to this area of North Carolina where he is researching and did stones there too. And so he got obsessed with comparing the stones. I don't know how much that book cost on the internet, but it's got a lot of pictures in it. I'll bet you it's a $100 book. It's really nice. And this stone is attributed to Bigham. And on it is a hand that's severed holding a sword. And this is what we commonly refer to as the Red Hand of Ulster. And so I'll tell you the story, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. So the story is a sort of a Scotch-Irish folk tale. It's mythology. It is definitely not true. Okay? But basically, the story goes that there are two chieftains that are squabbling over a piece of land in Ulster. And they go through a series of trials to see which one will win the contest and be awarded this tract of land. It goes into the last contest where it's a race in rowboats. And some versions, they row across the lake, they row across the, it's a body of water. In one version, I think they say it's the North Sea. But as they're rowing, the first person to touch land will be marked the winner. So as they are approaching, the chieftain is losing by a lot, but looking on the shore at all his relatives, he knew he could not let them down. So he pulled out his sword, he cut off his hand, and he threw it ahead of the other guy and touched land first. So when you read about it on the internet, it's a heraldic device, used in heraldry on the coat of arms, and it serves as a symbol for the province of Ulster in Ireland. It's also featured in the official coat of arms for the province of Ulster. And it's also a symbol for the Scotch-Irish, the Ulster Scots. The red hen is strongly associated with the identity and heritage of the Scotch-Irish and the descendants of Scottish and English Protestant settlers in Ulster, not just the Scots. So it's fascinating that this appears on so many graves in Adams County. I think it's on 5 graves here in the cemetery at least. And it's in Lower Marsh Creek, it's in Evergreen Cemetery, it's in Upper Marsh Creek Cemetery on Belmont Road. I'm sure I could think of others.
So, if you look at the American flag that is that I'm directly pointing to, the very first stone that you come across on this side of it, closest to us, is unusual in that it has symbology of not only the red hand of Ulster, but it also has the symbol of industry, gathered wheat. And on the other side, to balance out the philosophy of this individual, is the dove.
And the dove, I'm told, is because Noah sent the dove out. It's a symbol of rebirth for someone who has died. And also, we should mention that on some of the stones here, I think maybe a couple stones up, there's a face with wings coming out of it. And that also represents the soul rising from the grave towards heaven. And we see that in a lot of these stones. And this William Bingham, he did a lot of this artwork, so you can find this red hand of Ulster in a bunch of cemeteries. Now, there's also the idea that when the guy cut off his hand and threw it ahead to touch shore, it wasn't just for him. He was doing it for his family. He was sacrificing his hand for his family or for his country. The same way people are willing to sacrifice their lives in time of war for other people. And this is perfect in this cemetery for the Revolutionary War and the tie-in with these families. And I'm sure the men who served in the Revolutionary War from this area visited this grave and saw that on the grave. We could argue about how much symbolism it had for each person. But again, James Ross and his wife, 1741.
Right. So you notice right behind Tim, there's a modern stone, couple of stones for the kings. Down below here, this first row, because I think it's getting to the point where we don't really want to be traveling too much down in the lower 48. But this first row of stones on the right where you see an American flag, those are also the kings. And there are 2 members of the King family who fought in the Revolution, Hugh King and William King. Now, the important thing about, does anyone have a king in their bloodline?
McElhenney's do, I'll bet.
Yeah. These are descendants of John King, who first appeared in this area, and Victor King, who had a mill on the Conewago. The important thing about Victor King is that the very first public road that did not go east and west, like the ones that I told you about earlier tonight, but that instead went north and south, crossed the Conewago at Victor King's mill. And so the King family is long established in Strabane and Tyrone.
And Captain...
Very earliest. John King was one of the very earliest Presbyterians.
And Captain Captain Hugh King He actually served in a regiment with Robert McPherson, I believe, and he was captured at Fort Washington on November 16th, 1776, and was imprisoned for a number of months. So
This
he
is
was
the Battle of Brooklyn Heights.
oh
And the battle and the
Fort Washington.
and the retreat of
Yeah.
General Washington's troops.
So I also wanted to point out, buried down there is a guy named John Galbraith. Now, John Galbraith had two sons that served in the Revolutionary War armies. And John himself, who apparently is buried here but does not have a stone, was a French and Indian war soldier. We don't have many records at all of individuals in the French and Indian War, but according to a pension record for his wife that was younger when he married later in age, she survived into the 1850s. John Galbraith was enlisted one time, and that was at Byers on Conewago Creek, now Bell's Mill, Table Rock. So not too far from here. He was in the Army for 3 years on the French and Indian War, the time that Pittsburgh was taken. His officers were Hans Hamilton, the colonel of the regiment, and President Washington. So it mentions George Washington. And then it mentions that although John was older, as Mike mentioned, he actually served for a time in the American Revolution. The time of the Revolution, he was drafted to go to Philadelphia, his officers being McAllister, who was a colonel. That's the McAllister of Hanover, that Hanover is named after. And James Dixon was his captain, and James Dixon owned all the land just north of the Conewago church here, the Great Conewago.
In fact, James Dixon is one of the very earliest individuals that was granted a warrant for the land, 1742.
William Gillian was a first lieutenant. So for Galbraith and Gillian, William Gillian's buried down there. I want to tell you that this cemetery does an excellent job of placing flags on the graves of the veterans that we know of in the cemetery. So you can walk around and check out some of the enclosures. Some of the leading families have their graves enclosed by a metal or iron fence you can check out, and there's some Revolutionary War soldiers buried in there. Okay? Well, thank you guys for coming. What are you doing?
And we would strongly recommend that if tonight's program was something that piqued your interest, that you take the time, you've got the sheet, the cheat sheet, you come out here on your leisure. Utilize Find a Grave and do a little bit of your own rewarding research and come on out here and pay tribute to these families and to these people.
And come up and see the Red Hand of Ulster. It's really nice here.
Okay. Thank you very much.